The air in the cafe was heavy with the comforting scent of freshly brewed coffee, the soft hum of conversations blending with the clatter of plates and utensils. It seemed like an ordinary afternoon, the kind of day where nothing extraordinary was supposed to happen. But in a quiet corner, something was brewing, something no one expected. The veteran walked in, his presence commanding yet humble. He wasn't flashy, nor did he seek attention. He wore a faded jacket, one that spoke of years of service and stories untold. His boots, slightly scuffed, hinted at miles traveled and battles fought, though his demeanor was calm and kind. He had served his country with pride, defending freedoms that many took for granted. But today, he was just another customer looking for a warm meal and a place to sit. From the moment he stepped through the door, though, it was clear not everyone welcomed him. The cafe owner, a middle-aged man with a sharp gaze and an air of arrogance, stood behind the counter, his lips pressed into a thin line. Something about the veteran seemed to bother him, though the man had done nothing wrong. He simply approached the counter, placed his order politely, and waited patiently like everyone else. But the owner's eyes followed him with a look that could only be described as disdain. The cafe was busy, but it didn't take long for whispers to start. A few customers noticed the tension, though they weren't sure what it was about. One table in the corner, however, wasn't whispering. A small group sat there, silently observing, their expressions unreadable. They didn't stand out, just ordinary folks enjoying their afternoon. But their eyes missed nothing. When the veteran finally received his coffee and moved to sit down, the cafe owner made his move. In a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, he said, "I don't think you belong here." The room went silent, every head turning toward the commotion. The veteran froze, his cup halfway to the table. He turned to face the owner, his expression a mix of confusion and quiet dignity. "I'm sorry," he asked, his voice calm but firm. "You heard me," the owner snapped, his tone sharper now. "We don't serve people like you here." A murmur rippled through the cafe. Some people looked uncomfortable, others curious. But no one spoke up. The veteran, however, didn't back down. He straightened his posture, his eyes locking with the owner's. "I don't want any trouble," he said simply. "I just came for a cup of coffee." But the owner wasn't backing down either. His voice grew louder, angrier. "I said, you need to leave. Now." The veteran hesitated, his hands tightening around the cup. For a moment, it looked like he might argue. But then he sighed and nodded. Without another word, he turned to leave, his steps slow and deliberate. The room stayed silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. As the veteran reached the door, though, something happened. One of the people in the corner stood up. They weren't dressed in anything fancy, just jeans and a plain shirt. But the look on their face was enough to stop everyone in their tracks. They walked toward the veteran, their movements deliberate, their gaze fixed on the cafe owner. And that's when everything changed. The cafe fell into an uneasy silence as the person approached the veteran. The scrape of their chair against the floor was the only sound that broke through the stillness. All eyes were on them now, some curious, others tense, but no one dared to speak. The cafe owner's face darkened, clearly annoyed by the interruption, though he didn't say anything just yet. The veteran paused near the door, his hand on the handle, and turned slightly to see who had stood up. The person stopped a few steps away from him, looking him straight in the eye. "Excuse me," they said, their voice calm but steady, cutting through the tension in the room. "I couldn't help but notice how you were treated just now. Are you okay?" The veteran hesitated, glancing briefly at the cafe owner before nodding slightly. "I'm fine," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "It's not the first time something like this has happened." The person frowned, their expression hardening. "That doesn't make it right," they said firmly, turning their gaze toward the cafe owner. "What exactly is your problem?" The cafe owner, who had been watching the exchange with barely concealed irritation, folded his arms across his chest. "My problem? My problem is that this is my business, and I decide who I serve. He doesn't belong here, and I have every right to ask him to leave." "Doesn't belong here?" the person repeated, their voice rising slightly. "What exactly does that mean?" The cafe owner's face flushed, but he didn't back down. You know exactly what I mean. This isn't the kind of place for people like him. The room seemed to hold its breath at those words. Some customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between the cafe owner and the person who had stood up. Others stared at the veteran, their expressions unreadable. The tension in the air was palpable, and it felt as though something was about to snap. The veteran, who had been silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that hadn't been there before. "I've been in places like this before," he said, addressing the cafe owner directly. "I've seen people like you before. I fought for the right to walk into any establishment in this country without being judged for the color of my skin. But clearly some battles never end." The cafe owner scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "Spare me the speech. You can take your coffee and go somewhere else. You're not welcome here." The veteran nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Fair enough," he said quietly. But before he could turn to leave, the person who had stood up stepped closer, their expression a mix of anger and determination. "You might want to rethink your words," they said, their tone sharp now, "because you never know who's watching." The cafe owner laughed humorlessly, shaking his head. "Oh, please, don't try to scare me with that nonsense. I run a clean business, and I don't owe anyone an explanation." But the person didn't back down. They glanced around the room, their eyes landing on a few other customers who had been silently watching the scene unfold. "Did anyone else hear what I just heard?" they asked loudly, their voice carrying across the room. "Because I think we all know that what just happened here isn't right." A murmur of agreement rippled through the cafe, though no one spoke up directly. Some customers avoided eye contact, clearly uncomfortable, while others nodded subtly. The cafe owner looked around, his confidence faltering slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "This is my business," he said again, his tone defensive now. "I have the right to refuse service to anyone I choose, and we have the right to call out discrimination when we see it." The person shot back. "Do you even know who this man is? Do you have any idea what he's been through or what he's done for this country?" The cafe owner opened his mouth to respond, but the veteran raised a hand, stopping him. "It's fine," he said, his voice steady. "I don't need anyone to defend me. I've dealt with people like him before, and I'll deal with them again. But I appreciate your support." The person turned to him, their expression softening. "You shouldn't have to deal with this," they said quietly. "Not after everything you've done." The veteran smiled faintly, though there was a sadness in his eyes. "Unfortunately, some things never change," he said, "but I've learned to pick my battles." Before anyone could respond, the door to the cafe opened, and another customer walked in. They were dressed in casual clothes, but there was something about their demeanor that immediately drew attention. They paused just inside the door, taking in the scene before them. The cafe owner standing behind the counter, the veteran near the door, and the person who had stood up in the middle of it all. Their eyes narrowed slightly, and they stepped further into the room. "What's going on here?" they asked, their voice calm but authoritative. The cafe owner looked up, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "Nothing," he said quickly. "Just a misunderstanding. Everything's under control." The newcomer raised an eyebrow, glancing around the room. "Doesn't look like nothing to me," they said. Their gaze settled on the veteran, and something shifted in their expression. "Are you okay?" The veteran nodded slightly, though he didn't say anything. The newcomer turned to the cafe owner, their eyes sharp now. "I think you owe this man an apology." The cafe owner bristled, his face reddening. "I don't owe him anything," he snapped. "This is my business, and I'll run it how I see fit." The newcomer stepped closer, their posture calm but commanding. "You might want to reconsider that attitude," they said, their tone low but firm. "Because this isn't just about your business. This is about respect and decency. And from what I've seen, you're seriously lacking in both." The cafe owner opened his mouth to respond, but the newcomer cut him off. "I suggest you think carefully about your next words," they said. "Because I'm not the only one watching." The room went silent again, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The cafe owner looked around, clearly trying to gauge the mood of the room, but it was hard to tell where anyone stood. Some customers looked uncomfortable, others seemed angry, but no one was leaving. They were all waiting to see what would happen next. The veteran, who had been watching the exchange silently, finally spoke. "It's fine," he said again, his voice calm but resolute. "I've dealt with worse." But the newcomers shook their head. "It's not fine," they said, "and it's not something you should have to deal with. Not here, not anywhere." The veteran smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly. "But some things don't change overnight." The newcomer nodded, their expression thoughtful. "Maybe not," they said, "but that doesn't mean we stop trying." The room stayed silent, the weight of their words hanging in the air. No one moved, no one spoke, and it felt as though time itself had paused, waiting for something, anything, to break the tension. But what happened next would leave everyone in the cafe stunned. The cafe owner's stubborn expression didn't waver, though a flicker of uncertainty flashed across his face. The tension in the room had reached its peak, but he still stood firm, arms crossed over his chest like a man determined not to budge. Yet, the weight of so many eyes on him seemed to chip away at his confidence. The veteran glanced around the room, his shoulders squared, though his gaze was weary. He had spent much of his life facing challenges far greater than this, but the sting of prejudice still cut deep. It wasn't the confrontation itself that troubled him. It was the reminder that after all this time, some people still saw his skin color before anything else. He had fought wars overseas, but moments like these made him feel like he was still fighting battles at home. The person who had stood up, now standing at his side, took a step closer to the cafe owner. "What you're doing here isn't just wrong," they said, their voice louder now, with an edge of anger. "It's disgraceful. You don't get to treat people like this, especially not someone who's given so much to this country." "I don't owe him anything," the owner snapped back, his frustration boiling over. "I don't care who he is. He doesn't belong here, and I'm not going to let you or anyone else tell me how to run my business." But just as he finished his sentence, another voice spoke up from the back of the cafe. "That's enough." It wasn't loud, but it was firm enough to cut through the tension like a blade. A woman who had been sitting quietly in the corner rose from her seat. She was dressed in a sharp blazer and carried herself with an air of quiet authority. All eyes turned to her as she walked forward, her heels clicking against the floor. She stopped a few feet away from the counter, her gaze locked on the cafe owner. "Do you even know who you just insulted?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with intensity. The cafe owner blinked, thrown off by the sudden question. "I don't care who he is," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier bluster. "That doesn't change anything." The woman crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "You should care," she said, "because this man has done more for this country than you could even begin to imagine. And the fact that you don't recognize that says more about you than it does about him." The cafe owner opened his mouth to argue, but the woman wasn't finished. "Do you know how many veterans come home to face the same kind of treatment you just gave him? They've risked their lives for our freedom, and yet they walk into places like this and are treated like they're nothing. It's shameful." The room was completely silent now, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The veteran shifted uncomfortably, clearly not used to being the center of attention. He wasn't the type to seek recognition for his service. He had done what he believed was right, not for praise but for the greater good. Yet hearing someone speak so passionately on his behalf stirred something in him. Before the cafe owner could respond, another customer stood up. Then another. Slowly, more and more people rose from their seats, their faces a mix of anger and solidarity. One by one, they started speaking. "This isn't right. You can't treat people like this. This man deserves respect." The cafe owner looked around, his confidence faltering as the room seemed to turn against him. The voices weren't loud, but they carried a collective strength that was impossible to ignore. For the first time, he seemed to realize he might have made a mistake. But instead of apologizing, he doubled down. "You're all blowing this out of proportion," he said, his voice defensive now. "This is my business. I have the right to make my own decisions. And we have the right to call you out for it," one of the customers shot back. It was an older man who had been sitting near the window, his weathered face lined with quiet determination. "You think you can just treat people however you want without consequences? Not in this community." The cafe owner's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. The tension in the room was almost unbearable now, the air thick with unspoken conflict. And then, without warning, the door to the cafe opened again. A man in uniform walked in, a police officer. His presence immediately drew everyone's attention, the room falling silent once more. The officer looked around, taking in the scene. His gaze landed on the veteran, and his expression softened slightly. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, his tone neutral but concerned. The veteran hesitated, unsure of how to respond. He didn't want to escalate the situation further, but he also didn't want to let what had happened go unchallenged. Before he could speak, the woman in the blazer stepped forward. "There's been a problem," she said, her voice steady. This man was asked to leave the cafe for no reason other than the color of his skin. The officer's expression darkened slightly, but he kept his tone calm. "Is that true?" he asked, looking at the cafe owner. The owner bristled, his face reddening. "I don't owe anyone an explanation," he said, though his voice was less certain now. "I have the right to refuse service to anyone I choose." The officer nodded slowly, his gaze sharp. "That might be true," he said, "but that doesn't mean your actions don't have consequences." The cafe owner opened his mouth to argue, but the officer held up a hand. "I'm not here to arrest anyone," he said. "I'm here to make sure things don't get out of hand. But I'd suggest you think carefully about how you handle this situation moving forward. Because this isn't just about one man, it's about how you treat people in general. And the community is watching." The cafe owner didn't respond, his face pale now. The room stayed silent, the tension still thick, but there was a sense that something had shifted. The veteran looked at the officer, then at the woman in the blazer, and finally at the person who had stood up for him in the first place. He felt a surge of gratitude, though he didn't know how to express it. "This isn't over," the cafe owner muttered under his breath, but his voice lacked conviction. The veteran turned toward the door, ready to leave, but he paused for a moment. He looked back at the cafe, at the people who had stood up for him, and then at the cafe owner. "I didn't come here looking for trouble," he said quietly. "I just wanted a cup of coffee, but maybe this is what needed to happen. Maybe it's time people started paying attention." With that, he stepped outside, the doors swinging shut behind him. Inside, the cafe remained silent, the weight of his words lingering in the air. The people who had stood up for him exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of pride and determination. The cafe owner, meanwhile, looked down at the counter, his face a mask of frustration and uncertainty. But outside, in the bright afternoon sun, the veteran stood tall. For all the battles he had fought in his life, this one felt different, quieter, but no less important. And though the conflict wasn't resolved, he knew he wasn't alone in the fight. The veteran stood just outside the cafe, his back straight, but his thoughts were spinning. The warm sunlight felt distant compared to the heat of the confrontation he'd just walked away from. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This wasn't the first time he had faced something like this, and deep down, he doubted it would be the last. Still, something about this time felt different, like maybe it had struck a chord that wouldn't fade so quickly. Inside, the cafe was far from settled. The tension among the customers was thick, almost tangible. The cafe owner remained behind the counter, his expression unreadable, but his jaw set in defiance. The woman in the blazer lingered near the center of the room, her arms crossed, watching him carefully. She wasn't leaving, and it was clear she was waiting for something or someone to act. The officer who had entered moments earlier stood near the door, observing the cafe owner, but not making any moves just yet. He could sense the fragile energy in the room, the way the customers were on edge. One wrong word or action could easily tip the balance, and he didn't want to be the one to spark chaos. Still, his focus remained on the cafe owner, whose stubbornness had turned into a sort of quiet unease. The person who had stood up for the veteran was seated now, but their gaze hadn't left the cafe owner. They leaned slightly forward in their chair, as though ready to speak or act if the situation demanded it. Around them, other customers whispered quietly to each other, their voices carrying a mix of disbelief and anger. Some exchanged glances, silently agreeing that they wouldn't be coming back to this place anytime soon. Outside, the veteran stood by his car, staring at the ground. He couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter wasn't over yet. He had done his best to walk away with dignity, but the bitterness of the experience lingered. He glanced back at the cafe, his hand on the car door. He could see shadows moving inside through the window, but couldn't make out what was happening. A part of him wanted to leave, to put this behind him, but another part, a deeper part, felt like staying might matter. Inside, the cafe owner finally spoke, his voice breaking the uneasy quiet. "I don't understand why everyone's making such a big deal out of this," he muttered, though his words were loud enough for everyone to hear. "I've got my reasons for running my business the way I do. I'm not some villain." The woman in the blazer turned her sharp gaze to him. "You're not a villain?" she repeated, her tone incredulous. "Do you even hear yourself? You just refused service to a man who has done more for this country than you can imagine, all because you judged him without knowing a single thing about him." The cafe owner flushed, but his stubbornness held. "I don't see how that's anyone's business but mine," he replied, though his voice lacked the fire it had earlier. "I have the right to choose who I serve." "You're right," she said, stepping closer to the counter. "You do have that right. But what you fail to understand is that actions have consequences. This isn't just about your business anymore. It's about your reputation, your character. And from what I've seen, both are in serious trouble." The murmurs among the customers grew louder, their frustration clear. A younger man, sitting near the back of the cafe, stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You think people aren't going to talk about this?" he said, addressing the owner. "You think this isn't going to follow you? In this day and age, word spreads fast. You might want to think about how you want to be remembered." The cafe owner's face turned pale, his earlier confidence slipping further. He looked around the room, realizing for the first time just how many people were against him. His eyes darted to the officer near the door, as though seeking some kind of support, but the officer didn't move. "I'm just running my business," the cafe owner said again, though this time his voice was quieter, almost defensive. "That's all I've ever done." Outside, the veteran finally decided to step back toward the cafe. Something about the way the interaction had played out didn't sit right with him. He wasn't the kind of man to seek attention, but he couldn't shake the feeling that walking away might mean missing an opportunity to stand for something bigger than himself. He opened the door and stepped inside, and the sound of it swinging shut behind him drew every eye in the room. The chatter stopped abruptly, replaced by an almost electric silence. The veteran stood there for a moment, his gaze steady as he looked around the room. Finally, his eyes landed on the cafe owner. "I don't want your apology," he said simply, his voice calm but firm. "And I'm not here to change your mind. I've lived long enough to know that people like you don't change unless they want to. But I'll tell you this, you don't know me, and you don't know what I've been through. You see my skin and decide I don't belong. But I belong here just as much as anyone else. Maybe even more." The cafe owner swallowed hard, but he didn't respond. The veteran's words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The customers watched him, some nodding silently in agreement, others simply staring with admiration. The officer stepped forward slightly, his posture respectful. "Sir," he said to the veteran, his voice low but steady, "if there's anything you need, let us know. I think I speak for a lot of us when I say that you shouldn't have had to deal with this." The veteran gave him a small nod, appreciating the gesture. "Thank you," he said, though his tone was distant. His focus remained on the cafe owner, who was now fidgeting behind the counter, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of so many eyes. The woman in the blazer stepped forward again, standing next to the veteran. "You have a chance to make this right," she said to the cafe owner, her voice softer now, but no less intense. "I suggest you take it before this becomes something you can't come back from." The cafe owner didn't respond right away. He looked down at the counter, his hands gripping the edge tightly. It was clear he was struggling with something, whether it was pride, fear, or guilt, no one could say. The tension in the room was nearly unbearable, every second stretching longer than the last. Finally, he looked up, his face a mix of anger and uncertainty. But before he could speak, the door to the cafe opened again. This time, it wasn't another customer or an officer. It was someone who would change everything, someone whose presence would take the situation to an entirely new level, leaving everyone in the room holding their breath. The door swung open with a sharp creak, and the sound seemed to echo louder than it should have in the tense cafe. Heads turned, and an uneasy silence fell once again as a man stepped inside. He was older, with a neatly trimmed gray beard, and wearing a tailored suit that seemed to command attention without trying. His presence was striking, not because of any aggression or flashiness, but because he carried himself with an unspoken authority. The way his sharp eyes scanned the room made it clear he wasn't just another customer stepping in for a cup of coffee. The cafe owner's expression shifted the moment he saw the man, his face betraying a flicker of recognition and, for the first time, genuine unease. He stiffened behind the counter, his hands curling into fists, but he said nothing. The newcomer paused near the entrance, taking in the scene with a measured gaze. His eyes moved over the gathered customers, the officer standing near the door, the woman in the blazer, and finally, the veteran standing tall, but weary in the middle of it all. When he spoke, his voice was calm, deliberate, and carried an edge that made everyone in the room pay attention. "I couldn't help but overhear from outside," he said, his tone polite but layered with something sharper. "It seems I walked in on quite the scene." The cafe owner's jaw tightened, and he took a deep breath, clearly bracing himself. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low but laced with irritation. It was a question that carried weight, as though this man's presence alone was enough to make him uncomfortable. The suited man smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I was passing by and heard some interesting chatter," he said, glancing briefly at the customers who were still watching intently. "Thought I'd come in and see for myself." The veteran shifted slightly, unsure of who this man was or why the cafe owner seemed so rattled by him. The tension in the room, already thick, now felt like it was teetering on the edge of something even bigger. The woman in the blazer watched the interaction closely, her sharp gaze flicking between the two men as though trying to piece together a puzzle. The cafe owner finally stepped out from behind the counter, his movements stiff. "Look, I don't need you here," he said, his voice defensive. "This is my business, and I can handle it." The older man raised an eyebrow, his faint smile never wavering. "Handle it," he repeated, his tone cool. "Is that what you think you're doing? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're digging yourself into a hole you might not be able to climb out of." The cafe owner bristled at the comment, but he didn't respond. His discomfort was obvious now, and the customers could sense it too. Whispers started to ripple through the room again, people speculating about who this man was and why he seemed to have such a powerful effect on the owner. The suited man turned his attention to the veteran, his expression softening slightly. "Sir," he said, his voice steady, "I don't know the full extent of what happened here, but I can see it was wrong. You didn't deserve to be treated this way." The veteran nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially not like this. But something about this man's demeanor felt reassuring, as though he wasn't just there to talk. He was there to act. The cafe owner crossed his arms tightly over his chest, his frustration bubbling over. "You don't need to come in here and play hero," he said sharply. "This doesn't concern you." The man turned back to the cafe owner, and the faint smile finally faded. His expression hardened, and his voice dropped to a quieter, more dangerous tone. "You're wrong," he said. "It does concern me. It concerns everyone in this community. You think you can act like this and it won't come back to haunt you? Think again." The cafe owner's face flushed, but he didn't respond. It was clear he was struggling to maintain his composure, but the power dynamic in the room had shifted dramatically with the arrival of this newcomer. Then, as if to punctuate the moment, another unexpected development unfolded. One of the customers, who had been quietly filming the entire confrontation on their phone, stepped forward. They held up the device, the screen showing that they had been live streaming to social media the entire time. The video already had hundreds of comments and shares, the viewer count climbing by the second. "Just so you know," the customer said, their voice steady, "the whole world is watching now." The cafe owner's eyes widened, and for a moment, he looked genuinely panicked. He glanced at the phone, then at the suited man, then at the veteran, as if trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. The whispers among the customers grew louder, their tone shifting to one of anticipation. It wasn't just a local issue anymore, it was going viral. The suited man glanced at the live stream briefly, then back at the cafe owner. "Well," he said calmly, "it seems you've made quite the impression. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" The veteran, still standing quietly in the center of the room, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He hadn't asked for any of this attention, but now that it was here, he realized it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something bigger, about calling out injustice and standing up for what was right. The cafe owner opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. He was visibly flustered now, his earlier bravado completely gone. The weight of the live stream, the gathered customers, and the newcomer's piercing gaze was clearly overwhelming him. But the suited man wasn't done. He stepped closer to the cafe owner, his voice dropping to a near whisper that still carried through the room. "You can keep digging your heels in," he said, "or you can take a long, hard look at the damage you've already done and try to make it right. The choice is yours, but I suggest you make it quickly, because the clock is ticking and the world doesn't wait." The tension in the room reached its breaking point, every person holding their breath as they waited to see what would happen next. The cafe owner's face was a mix of anger, fear, and desperation, his mind clearly racing as he tried to decide his next move. The veteran, the suited man, the customers, the officer, everyone was watching. And outside, through the cafe windows, a small crowd had started to gather, drawn by the commotion and the live stream. The stakes had never been higher, and the outcome of the conflict hung in the balance. But whatever happened next, it was clear that this moment would have lasting consequences. For the cafe owner, for the veteran, and for everyone else who had witnessed it unfold. The cafe owner's face went pale as he stood frozen, staring at the phone that had broadcasted his actions to the world. His eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but there was none. The customers' faces were a mix of judgment, disappointment, and anger. Even the officer by the door, who had remained neutral up to this point, now seemed to have lost all sympathy for the man behind the counter. The cafe owner opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out, as though the weight of his own actions had rendered him powerless. The veteran, standing strong in the center of the room, broke the silence. "You don't need to prove anything to me," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "But I hope you take a moment to ask yourself who you really want to be. Because the man you've been today, that's not someone people will respect or follow. That's someone people will remember for all the wrong reasons." The suited man stepped forward again, this time addressing the crowd as much as the cafe owner. "This isn't just about one man or one business," he said, his voice carrying an undeniable authority. "It's about the kind of community we want to build, the values we want to uphold. We all have a choice in moments like this, whether to stand by and do nothing or to demand better." The tension in the room was palpable as the cafe owner finally spoke. His voice was shaky, a stark contrast to the defiance he had shown earlier. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he muttered, avoiding eye contact with anyone. "I didn't think it would. I didn't think people would care this much." The woman in the blazer stepped forward, her tone measured but firm. "That's the problem," she said. "You didn't think. You acted out of prejudice, out of ignorance, and now you're facing the consequences. But here's the thing. This is your chance to make it right. To own up to what you've done and show that you're willing to change." The cafe owner hesitated, his pride clearly warring with the reality of the situation. He looked at the veteran, who stood silently watching him, and then at the suited man, whose piercing gaze didn't waver. Finally, he let out a long, shaky breath. I'm sorry," he said, though the words felt forced, as if dragged out of him against his will. "I shouldn't have treated you that way. I'll let my own issues get the better of me." The apology hung in the air, but it was met with silence. The veteran didn't respond right away, and the customers didn't applaud or cheer. It wasn't enough, not yet. The cafe owner seemed to sense this, and he shifted uncomfortably, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. "I'll do better," he added quickly, though his voice lacked conviction. "I'll try to fix things." The suited man raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Words are a start," he said, "but actions speak louder. The people in this room, and the people watching online, aren't going to forget what you've done. It's up to you to prove that you mean what you say." The cafe owner nodded stiffly, but before he could say anything else, the door swung open again. This time, it wasn't another stranger or a bystander. It was a young man, no older than 20, dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans. His face was tense, and he carried a worn leather bag slung over his shoulder. As he stepped inside, his eyes immediately found the cafe owner, and his expression shifted to one of quiet determination. "Dad," the young man said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. The word hit the room like a thunderclap. The cafe owner's head snapped up, his eyes wide. "Elliot," he stammered, his tone a mix of shock and uncertainty. What are you doing here?" The young man didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced around the room, taking in the tension, the phone still streaming live, the veteran standing tall, and a suited man watching everything unfold with sharp eyes. Finally, Elliot turned back to his father. "I saw the video," he said simply, "and I couldn't just sit back and say nothing." The cafe owner's face flushed with embarrassment, and he looked down at the counter. "This isn't your business," he said weakly, his earlier bravado completely gone. "You don't understand." "No," Elliot interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "I do understand. I understand that this isn't the first time you've acted like this. I've seen it before, at home, at family gatherings, even with strangers. And I stayed quiet because I thought it wasn't my place to speak up. But not anymore." The cafe was completely silent now, every eye on the young man as he stood his ground. Even the cafe owner seemed at a loss for words, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to respond. Elliot took a deep breath and turned to the veteran. "I want to apologize," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "On behalf of my father and my family. What he did was wrong, and it doesn't reflect the kind of person I want to be. You didn't deserve any of this." The veteran looked at him, surprised by the unexpected twist. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. Finally, he nodded, a small but meaningful gesture. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice steady. Elliot turned back to his father, his expression firm. "You always told me to stand up for what's right," he said. "Well, now it's your turn to practice what you preach. If you're really sorry, show it. Not just with words, but with actions." The cafe owner seemed to crumble under the weight of his son's words. He looked around the room, at the faces staring back at him, and finally let out a shaky breath. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "I've got a lot to make up for, and I don't know if I can, but I'll try." The tension in the room began to ease, though the atmosphere was still heavy. The suited man nodded slightly, as if to signal that the moment had passed, but his sharp eyes remained watchful. The customers began to murmur among themselves, some looking relieved, others skeptical. The veteran gave one last glance at the cafe owner before turning to leave, his head held high. As he stepped outside, the sunlight felt warmer than before, a reminder that even in moments of darkness, there was always a chance for light to break through. But just as he reached his car, his phone buzzed with a message. He glanced at the screen, and his expression shifted from calm to surprise. The message read, "You don't know me, but I was watching. I've got something to share with you. Call me?" The veteran paused, his curiosity piqued. He looked back at the cafe one last time before stepping into his car, the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. The story wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. The veteran sat in his car, staring at the message on his phone. The events of the day still weighed on him, but something about the text pulled his thoughts in a new direction. He didn't recognize the number, but the message carried a strange sense of urgency, as if it was meant just for him. After a moment of hesitation, he dialed the number. It rang only once before someone picked up. "Hello?" the voice on the other end said. It was steady, confident, but with a hint of excitement. "Is this Mr. Carter?" The veteran from the cafe. "Yes, this is Carter," he replied cautiously. "Who's this?" The voice introduced itself as Emily, a journalist who had been following the live stream from the cafe. She explained that she worked for a regional news outlet and had been moved by what she witnessed. "I've been covering stories about community and accountability for years," she said, "but this one struck a nerve. I'd like to meet with you, if you're open to it. I think there's more to this story than just what happened today." Carter hesitated. He wasn't sure he wanted any more attention. But something about her tone, the way she spoke with conviction, made him feel like there might be a greater purpose to all this. "All right," he said finally. "Where should we meet?" They agreed on a small diner just outside town, a neutral place where they could talk. Carter arrived first, his mind still processing everything that had happened at the cafe. The apology from the owner, the unexpected courage of his son, Elliot, and now this call. It felt like a whirlwind he couldn't quite escape. Emily arrived a few minutes later, carrying a notebook and a sense of purpose. She was young, but carried herself with the poise of someone who had seen and heard a lot in her career. As she sat down across from Carter, she smiled warmly. "Thank you for meeting with me," she said. "I know it's been a long day." Carter nodded. "What is it you're hoping to find out?" he asked, getting straight to the point. Emily leaned forward slightly, her expression serious. "I think this story is bigger than just one man and his mistakes," she said. "It's about what happens when people stand up for what's right, when they call out prejudice and demand accountability. But it's also about the ripple effects. What happened in that cafe today is already spreading across social media. People are talking about it, debating it, and some are even taking sides. I want to make sure the real story, the human story, gets told." Carter listened carefully, her words resonating with him. He had always believed in standing up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. It was why he had served his country, why he had carried himself with dignity even when others tried to tear him down. But hearing someone else frame it as a story that could inspire others made him see the day's events in a new light. "I'm not looking to be a hero," he said finally. "I just want people to treat each other with respect. That's not asking for much, is it?" Emily smiled gently. "No, it's not," she said. "But sometimes the simplest truths are the hardest for people to live by. Your story might just remind them of what really matters." They spent the next hour talking, Emily asking thoughtful questions, and Carter sharing his perspective. He talked about his time in the military, the values he had learned there, and the challenges he had faced as a Black veteran in a world that didn't always honor his sacrifices. He also shared how the cafe incident had made him feel. Hurt, angry, but also determined to not let one man's prejudice define his worth. By the end of their conversation, Emily seemed genuinely moved. "Thank you for trusting me with this," she said. "I promise I'll do my best to tell your story honestly and respectfully." As Carter drove home that evening, he felt a strange mix of exhaustion and hope. The day had been draining, but it had also reminded him of the power of standing firm in the face of injustice. He didn't know what would come of the article Emily planned to write or the conversations that were happening online, but he hoped it would lead to something positive, a change, even if just a small one. Meanwhile, back at the cafe, the owner was facing his own reckoning. The live stream had gone viral, and the backlash was swift. People flooded the cafe's social media pages with comments, some calling for boycotts, others offering suggestions on how he could make amends. Elliot stayed behind to help his father navigate the fallout, but their conversations were tense. "You got a lot to answer for, Dad," Elliot said bluntly as they closed up for the night. "But you also have a chance to make things right. Don't waste it." The owner nodded silently, the weight of the day's events pressing heavily on him. He wasn't sure how to begin fixing the damage he had caused, but he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. Over the next few weeks, the cafe became a focal point of the community, not as a place of division, but as a space for dialogue and growth. The owner publicly apologized, not just to Carter, but to the entire community. He organized events to support veterans and other marginalized groups, with Elliot by his side to ensure the changes were genuine. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but it was a start. As for Carter, he kept a low profile, though he stayed in touch with Emily and occasionally checked the articles and stories that emerged from the cafe incident. One evening, as he read through a particularly thoughtful piece about the power of community accountability, he received another message, this time from Elliot. The text was simple but heartfelt. "Thank you for standing your ground that day. It opened my eyes to things I hadn't been brave enough to confront. I'm trying to do better. For you, for my dad, and for everyone watching." Carter smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in days. The ripple effects Emily had talked about were real, and they were reaching places he hadn't even imagined. In the end, the cafe incident became more than just a viral story. It became a catalyst for change, a reminder that even the smallest actions can have a profound impact. For Carter, it reaffirmed his belief in the strength of standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. And for the community, it was a lesson in accountability, growth, and the importance of coming together to create a better future. As Carter looked out at the setting sun that evening, he felt a deep sense of peace. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it, and in his heart, he knew the story wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had the courage to face their own biases, challenge injustice, and choose a better path forward.